I'm Peter Thomas, your auto tape tour guide. If you're like most visitors to Gettysburg, you're anxious to get going. But before we start our tour of the battlefield, let's just sit here a few minutes while I fill you in on some pertinent background material to help you have a better understanding of what you're about to see. As you recall, the Civil War began in April 1861. For the next 4 years, the war that raged was more than a battle between states. It was a war that set brother against brother. Fierce loyalties to the cause of either the North or South ripped families to shreds emotionally. President Lincoln himself had 4 brothers-in-law who served in the Confederate Army. In a war of so many emotional and violent battles, Gettysburg is probably the most controversial. During and after the battle, many reports filed by officers were conflicting and often substituted impression for fact. As a result, no two historians' interpretations seem to be of the same mind as to why certain things happened as they did. But one thing everyone seems to agree on is that neither of the participating commanders had any intention of clashing at Gettysburg. Why then did this quiet little college town become the arena of one of the bloodiest battles of the war, where more than 51,000 men were killed, wounded, or captured? Our tour will take us through this battlefield, and we're going to try to cover the action in sequence from the first day on. Naturally, we don't expect this tour to make you a battle expert. We just want to bring you the highlights of the battle and some of the dramatic personal stories of the men who fought it. This way, we think you'll come out with a better understanding and a deeper feeling of what happened here on July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd of 1863. Before we get going, look at your auto tape tour map. Note the route we'll be taking. Our tour starts as soon as we pull out of the parking lot and have turned onto Route 15 headed north. Watch the signs and follow this route through town until you reach the traffic circle. At the circle, make a 3/4 turn to get on and stay on Route 30 West. Our first stop is just over 2 miles from here. Now, just one more thing. The beginning of our tour starts at a speed of 20 miles an hour. Try to keep as close to that as possible. If you should make an unscheduled stop or get stalled in a traffic jam, switch me off. Switch me on when you start driving again. Got it all? Good. Now, turn me off until we're out of the parking lot and have started driving north on Route 15. Then, turn me on again. We don't make our first stop until we've gone through town and traveled more than 2 miles to the area where the battle began. So for now, let me tell you some interesting sidelights about the town of Gettysburg. Before the Civil War, this was a sedate little town with a population of about 2,400. Its main claim to fame was Pennsylvania College, now called Gettysburg College, and the Lutheran Seminary. Both institutions are still here, but the population is now somewhere about 8,000. Today, the area is one of the nation's leading peach and apple producing sections. Although the town itself hasn't spread out all that much, every year it plays host to over 1 million visitors who come here, like you, to visit the historic battlefield. Of course, with the modern signs and all, the face of the town has changed considerably. Yet, some of the houses we pass on our tour stood here at the time of the battle. When you see a small bronze plaque fastened to the outside of a house, that means the house is of Civil War vintage. Occasionally, you see holes in the sides of houses. These are original battle scars, holes caused by cannon or gunshot during the battle. You should soon be approaching the traffic circle, And when you do, you'll see a 3-story brick house on the right as you're making the turn. In 1863, this house was home to attorney David Wills, and here President Lincoln was an overnight guest on November 18, 1863. In this house, Mr. Lincoln finished a draft of the immortal Gettysburg Address, which he delivered the next day. Did you know that originally Lincoln wasn't even invited to speak at the ceremonies? It was a polite afterthought. I'll tell you more about that later. For now, please turn me off until after we've gone around the traffic circle and are heading west on Route 30. Be sure to follow the signs directing you on this route. As you probably remember from your history lessons, at the beginning of the Civil War, there was no overall commander-in-chief for either the Northern or Southern armies. Both sides had armies fighting in the Western Theater and armies fighting in the Eastern Theater. Each army had its own commander. The armies that fought in the East and ultimately here in Gettysburg were the Army of Northern Virginia for the South and the Army of the Potomac for the North. If there are any children in the car, let me explain. When we refer to Confederates, those are the Southerners. The Union or Federal soldiers are Northerners. As we near the scene of the first day's battle, let me outline what preceded it. The Confederates had been enjoying victory after victory in the South. In the spring of 1863, after their triumph at Chancellorsville, Virginia, they were marching north. It's believed Lee wanted to fight in Pennsylvania, hoping a victory here would threaten the security of the northern states and force Lincoln to negotiate peace. By June 28th, Lee's army was already in this vicinity. Meanwhile, on June 28th, the commander of the Union forces had resigned and had been replaced by General George G. Meade. Meade immediately began moving his army north and assembled them south of Gettysburg. By June 30th, advance units from both armies had been in and out of the town, scouting and picking up supplies. There had been a few skirmishes, but certainly no major outbreaks. Right now, you should be approaching the edge of town and heading up a hill called Seminary Ridge. As you do so, you'll pass a broad open lawn on your left and notice some buildings on the left at the top of the ridge. These are part of the Gettysburg Lutheran Seminary, founded in 1826, the oldest Lutheran seminary in the United States. The seminary campus was in the thick of the fighting on the afternoon of July 1st, and 3 original buildings still stand. One of them, called Old Dorm, has a small cupola on top that was used as an observation post during the battle. Past the seminary, on the left side of the road, we'll see an upright cannon. Upright cannons throughout the park indicate where a general in either army had his headquarters. The first one you see marks the spot of General Lee's field headquarters during a phase of the battle. As you pass the seminary, you will leave the town limits and continue traveling west on Route 30 about a half mile, crossing open fields that were the scene of some of the first day's fighting. Up ahead will be a traffic light. Proceed through the light and make your first left-hand turn. Right across the road from that left turn are 2 statues close together. The first statue of an officer on a horse is Major General John F. Reynolds, a native of Lancaster, Pennsylvania. He was 1st Corps commander of the Union Army of the Potomac, and not more than 15 minutes after he arrived on the scene of the first day's battle, he was shot dead, the highest-ranking Union officer killed at Gettysburg. The second statue is of General John Buford, who commanded the Union cavalry that fired the first shots of the battle. Buford was a native of Kentucky and had a brother serving in the Confederate Army. When we get to the Buford and Reynolds statues, don't stop the car. There's no real pullout, and the traffic is pretty heavy along here. Besides, we make a left turn just opposite the 2 statues.
In fact, that turn should be coming up very soon. It's a dangerous one, so be extra careful. After turning, reduce our speed to 15 miles an hour and try to keep it at that till I tell you to change. Right after our turn, you'll see a monument on our left. Shortly past that, you'll see a statue of a local hero, John Burns. Let's stop the car in front of that statue. Turn me off till we're parked. Then turn me on again, because I'm going to explain how it was just before the first shot of the battle was fired.
At the time of the battle, the property we're on now was known as McPherson's Farm. If you look over your left shoulder, behind us, you can see McPherson's barn, all that remains of McPherson's farm buildings. Still looking over to our left, you can see Seminary Ridge and Old Dorm, the building with the green cupola on it. Now, let's look over to the fields on our right. We're now looking in the direction where most of the Confederate Army was gathered. One of the big problems General Lee was having was the loss of contact with his cavalry. What happened was that during their northward march, a great portion of his cavalry had gone further north towards Washington. As a Confederate cavalry commander, it was one of Jeb Stuart's functions to act as eyes and ears of Lee's army. But by advancing his men around Washington, he allowed Union troops to come between himself and Lee. As a result, at the end of June, Lee was pretty much in the dark about his enemy's whereabouts. On June 30th, the Confederates sent some soldiers down to scout around Gettysburg, get an idea of the Union Army's strength and positions, and bring back some supplies. The scouts reported back that there were Federal soldiers in Gettysburg, and the Confederates decided to chase the Union soldiers out of Gettysburg. The plan was to send an entire division, about 7,000 men, into Gettysburg the next morning, July 1st. But the Union Army had a good line of communications, and when the first Confederate skirmishers started to advance towards Gettysburg the next morning, Union cavalry was waiting for them. By 8 o'clock that morning, the two armies collided, and the Battle of Gettysburg was underway. For the first hour, the Union's fighting cavalrymen put up a strong fight and held their ground. But greatly outnumbered, they were finally pushed back past McPherson's barn. As they started their retreat, General John F. Reynolds arrived on the field. He viewed the situation and immediately called in his corps to help the exhausted Union soldiers. About 10 o'clock, troops began streaming over Seminary Ridge towards where we are now. Among Reynolds' reinforcements was the famous Iron Brigade. During the Battle of Gettysburg, this brigade consisted of volunteers from Michigan, Wisconsin, and Indiana. They'd earned a reputation as tough, hard fighters and were distinguished by the black felt hats many of them wore. Their hats spoke as loudly as if they had brought a regimental band. When they arrived on the battlefield, everyone knew it. Bolstered by their reinforcements, the Union Army became the aggressor. The morning of July 1st ended with the Confederates pushed back to the positions they held the first hours of battle.
If anything could be said to have relieved the tensions of those first hours of battle, it was the appearance on the battlefield of John Burns. At the time of the battle, he was in his 70s. On July 1st, he grabbed a gun and ran out on the field to help the Union soldiers. An observer is reported to have said, "I tell you, I've never seen such spunk in an old man." Burns was wounded 3 times that day. Stories about him spread far and wide. It's said that even Lincoln heard of him, and when he came to Gettysburg, especially asked to meet Burns. Whether all this is true or not, John Burns earned a statue commemorating him as a local hero.
We're going to leave the parking area now and follow our road to the stop sign, where we'll turn left.
Father Abraham, 300,000 more. We are coming, Father Abraham, 300,000 more. From Mississippi's winding stream and from New England's shores, we leave our plows and workshops, our wives and children dear.
When we make that left, we'll be on Reynolds Avenue. And from then on, our route follows that of the park's battlefield tour signs.
We dare not look behind us, but steadily before. We are coming, Father Abraham, 300,000 more. We are coming.
Don't forget, we'll be driving at 15 miles an hour till I tell you otherwise. If you go much faster or slower, then what I'm saying won't match what you're seeing. So please try to keep our drive paced. Okay?
As you reach the stop sign, look to your right, and you'll see a monument honoring General Abner Doubleday. When General Reynolds was killed that first day, his command was temporarily assumed by the next in rank, Major General Abner Doubleday. A native of Ballston Spa, New York, and a West Point graduate, Doubleday was a captain at Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina, in April 1861. And it has been said that he was the man that aimed the first Union shot that launched the Civil War. Now, turn me off until we reach the stop sign at Route 30. Then, turn me on again.
At the time of the battle, there was no railroad west of Gettysburg, but one was planned and an excavation had been cut out for it. Right after we cross over Route 30 again, we'll be driving over the railroad cut. It was the scene of one of the South's most embarrassing setbacks of the first day's fighting. When they drove the Northern soldiers out, they made the mistake of getting into the railroad cut. Later, the Union soldiers caught the Confederates down there and captured about 200 Mississippians of Davis's brigade. General Davis, by the way, was a nephew of Jefferson Davis, president of the Confederacy. On this battlefield, there are over 2,000 markers and monuments. If I tried to identify and explain every one, we'd be here forever. And besides, you'd probably get bored and fidgety, so we've selected the ones we think are the most interesting for one reason or another. But I will mention that all the bronze plaques you see mounted on a round base honor units of the Confederate Army. Those mounted on squares honor units of the Union Army. I mentioned a little while ago about the disappearance of a big part of Lee's cavalry. After the battle, it became almost a national sport, especially in the South, to blame General Jeb Stuart, commander of the cavalry, for Lee's defeat at Gettysburg. It was a long time before historians began to untangle facts and evidence that gave a clearer picture of the situation. Today, there are still those who maintain he was guilty of insubordination. Others believe instructions he received from Lee were unclear, and it was a matter of misinterpretation. But like I said before, this was a battle filled with controversies, and the question of Stuart's contribution to the South's defeat at Gettysburg is still a controversial issue. All the markers on the wooded hill ahead of us are Southern, except the big monument with the flame at the top. That's the Eternal Light Peace Memorial, and it is dedicated to the memory of both Northern and Southern soldiers who gave their lives during this battle. Our next stop is at the Eternal Light Peace Memorial up ahead. Here in the middle of what was once a battlefield where brother slew brother and friend friend, here stands the peace light, shining hopefully, eternally, even in the darkest nights and most foreboding storms. Today, the peace light illuminates the countryside, its constant light symbolizing man's struggle against the darkness of war and his eternal hope for lasting peace for all people. Dedicated 75 years after the Battle of Gettysburg and 20 years after the War to End All Wars, World War I, this peace light was ignited by Franklin D. Roosevelt on July 3, 1938. 3 years later, the blood of America was committed to another struggle, World War II. At the time the peace light was dedicated, there were still about 8,000 living veterans of the Civil War. Congress offered to pay the cost of any of them who wished to come to Gettysburg for the solemn occasion. The average age of these vets was 94, yet 1,864 of them managed to get here to pay tribute to the memory of comrades who fought and died in the Civil War.
From the parking area of the Peace Light, you may want to get out and take pictures, as you have a terrific panoramic view of the field. So turn me off now and turn me on again when you leave the parking lot.
Our next stop is at the Oak Ridge Observation Tower, which comes up on our left after we cross the highway. There are 3 observation towers in Gettysburg National Military Park, but of course, none of them existed during the war. The Oak Ridge Tower was built in 1895. If you leave the car when you're at the tower, look across the road for the 12th Massachusetts Regiment marker. This unit was nicknamed the Webster Regiment. If the picture on the marker looks familiar, that's because it's a likeness of Daniel Webster, whose son at one time commanded this regiment.
Now, please turn me off until we reach the tower. Then, turn me on again. From our car, look down the hill. The town of Gettysburg is off to the right, and directly below you are the tracks of the old Gettysburg and Harrisburg Railroad, opened in 1884. Just beyond the road in the distance are open fields that played an important role in the first day's battle. Now, try to imagine this picture. It's about 2:30 in the afternoon of the first day of battle. There's been about a 2-hour lull in the day's fighting. Both sides are planning their new tactics. Union reinforcements of the 11th Corps, commanded by General O.O. Howard, have arrived and taken positions in the fields below to protect the Union right flank. Suddenly, columns of Confederate infantrymen pour out of the fields on your left and attack the Union 11th Corps. Other Confederates attack near McPherson's farm again, while others strike the Union line, located right here where you're parked. The whole battlefield across more than a 2-mile front is now ablaze. And before the end of the day, about 18,000 Union soldiers and 23,000 Confederate soldiers are locked in another savage battle. As the day wears on, the battlefield becomes littered with the bodies of the wounded, the dead, and the dying. At about 4:30 in the afternoon, General Lee and one of his officers, General A.P. Hill, are standing on Seminary Ridge, watching the Union soldiers retreating from the fields in front of you and heading right through Gettysburg towards Cemetery Hill at the other end of town. Incidentally, you can see Cemetery Hill from here if you look to your right for a light-colored water tower standing near the top of the hill. General Hill mistakenly believes the Union forces are in trouble, but General Lee knows that Cemetery Hill can be quite an advantage for the Northern Army. He assumes, and he's quite correct, that they are preparing for another stand.
Many historians agree that the South might have ended the Battle of Gettysburg in total victory at the end of the first day of fighting, if they'd gone after the dazed, defeated, and vulnerable Union troops who'd retreated to Cemetery Hill. But that's one of the many ifs that seem to characterize this battle. I'll tell you more about it later. For now, if you want to take pictures, turn me off and turn me on after we've started driving again. Otherwise, let's continue our drive.
Our next stop is at the North Carolina Memorial on Seminary Ridge, about 2 miles from here. To get there, we follow the battlefield tour signs, traveling at a speed of 15 miles per hour. For now, go straight and follow the road around to your right until we reach the stop sign. Now, just as we get going, I'd like to ask any children who may be in the car to keep an eye out for a statue of a Union soldier up ahead who's holding his gun up in the air. Do you see him? Right in front of the soldier is another statue, this one of a little dog named Sally Ann. Sally Ann was the mascot of the 11th Pennsylvania Regiment, and all the soldiers loved her. She was so loyal that after the first day of the battle, she refused to leave the wounded men of the regiment that were lying here, and she stood guard by them without food or water for the rest of the battle. The men never forgot their brave little dog, and after the war, they put up this monument honoring her. We should be at the stop sign on Reynolds Avenue. Here we make a left turn and continue straight until we reach the traffic light. We make a left turn onto Route 30 and go about a half a mile. We turn right onto North Hay Street, right again onto Springs Avenue, and a quick left onto Seminary Ridge. Got it? Just follow the battlefield tour signs. Now, getting back to the controversy of the first day's battle that we were discussing earlier.
Civil War buffs are fond of arguing the reasons why the Confederates didn't attack the Union troops who retreated to Cemetery Hill on the first day. Some blame General Lee's discretionary orders, which told his commanding general to attack the hill if practicable. Well, this may be true, but it's only fair to try to understand why a general of Lee's boldness and brilliance would issue such a cautious-sounding order. The answer may lie in this explanation. Until the campaign at Chancellorsville, General Lee's most valuable officer had been Stonewall Jackson. They had a rapport, and Jackson understood Lee's thoughts almost before he uttered them. When Lee issued orders to Jackson, he was confident Jackson would relay it to other officers and see that they were carried out almost exactly as Lee himself would. But Jackson had been mortally wounded at Chancellorsville, robbing Lee of what he described as his right arm. They were close friends as well as military comrades, and Lee was left with no single officer to replace Jackson. Where he'd formerly had 2 corps, he now formed 3. His friend, General James A. Longstreet, was kept in command of 1. Lee appointed Generals A.P. Hill and Richard S. Ewell to command the other 2. Both were officers with good records, but for Lee, they couldn't replace Jackson. Neither understood him the way Jackson did, and as a result, Lee's orders were easily misunderstood or misinterpreted.
This appears to be what happened at Cemetery Hill. When Lee sent General Ewell orders to attack the hill if practicable, it was about 4 in the afternoon of the first day. His men had fought a hard and valiant battle earlier, and they were hot and tired. Ewell himself may not have been feeling well, for he had lost 1 leg the year before, and the stump of that leg still bothered him. But most important was that Ewell didn't know for certain that it was practicable to attack. He had no knowledge of the enemy's position or numbers on Cemetery Hill. Rather than plunge his men into what could be a fatal skirmish, he decided to send scouts up to find out what was going on up the hill. By the time his scouts returned, it was just a few hours before sunset, and it was his decision to wait till daylight before attacking. Unfortunately for his side, the decision proved to be the wrong one. By waiting, he gave the Union troops time to replenish and reposition their men and build a strong defense line. Afterwards, many historians blamed Ewell for being too cautious, pointing out that if he'd attacked immediately, he might have crippled the Union Army so badly the battle might have ended that first day in victory for the South. Ewell's defenders, however, assert that Lee should have given Ewell more specific orders, and that Ewell did only what any good leader would have done. If some historians have looked to blame General Ewell and others for the Confederate failure to win a sweeping victory on July 1st, others have looked at the Union Army's performance and both praised and criticized it. General Reynolds' First Corps has often been praised for its fighting on July 1st, but the 11th Corps, commanded by General Howard, hasn't fared so well. General Oliver Otis Howard was a Yankee from Maine. When he replaced Major General Frank Sigel, many of the men he commanded resented him. Sigel, like many of the men in the 11th Corps, was of German background. The men liked him and resented Howard. After the first day's battle, the 11th Corps was criticized for the disorderly way it retreated toward Cemetery Hill. Many blamed that fact on the Germans, saying they marched well but fought badly. Unfortunately, this kind of statement was more prejudicial than truthful. Records show that the 11th Corps had more than their share of good, competent officers and loyal soldiers. You should now be on the corner of Springs Avenue and Seminary Ridge. Make a left turn. Go through the traffic light and continue straight until you reach the North Carolina Memorial, driving at a speed of 15 miles per hour.
If this were July 2nd or 3rd, 1863, we'd be driving behind the Confederate lines. The music we hear would probably be Dixie.
The shout was in the land of cotton, old times there are not forgotten. Look away, look away, look away, Dixieland. In Dixieland where I was born in early on one frosty morning. Look away, look away, look away, Dixieland. Then I wish I was in Dixieland.
Want to know something interesting about the song? During the Civil War, the South adopted it as their national anthem, but it was actually written by a man who'd come from the North. By the way, some youngsters may not know how the word Dixie came about. One explanation is that it's an abbreviation of the words Mason and Dixon line. That's the surveyor's line that separated the North from the South, the invisible line that separated the states of Pennsylvania and Maryland. Mason and Dixon were the names of the two surveyors who drew the line. The Mason-Dixon line is only about 6 miles from where you are right now.
You should be approaching the North Carolina Memorial shortly. The monument will be on the left and the pull-off to the right. When you reach the pull-off, stop the car, but continue the tape.
Getting back to the battle, July 2nd was a day of delays, misinformation, and more ifs. Most of the Southern officers were elated with the way the first day went. They thought they were hugely successful and could easily take the Union Army apart piece by piece. Lee wanted to make an early attack on July 2nd, but several of his high-ranking officers opposed this. After hours of delays caused by opposition, misinformation, and difficulty in coordinating troop movements, the Confederates attacked. But that didn't happen till 4 o'clock in the afternoon at Little Round Top, giving the Union forces plenty of time to shift their strength and be ready for the onslaught.
If General Lee was experiencing difficulties in getting started, General Meade was having problems of his own. At one point, his chief engineer was making an inspection tour. He discovered that an entire corps, which was supposed to be positioned at the southern end of Meade's defense line, had shifted.
This situation was remedied, and just in the nick of time, too. If replacements had been sent there 5 minutes later, it might have meant disaster for Meade's army on July 2nd. This incident became a real cause célèbre and was reviewed on February 1864 before the Committee on the Conduct of the War. The general who'd shifted his men forward was a New York lawyer turned Army officer named Daniel E. Sickles. He defended his behavior in a way that many historians have accepted as fact. Whether Dan Sickles was right or wrong, whether Dan Sickles misinterpreted orders or acted insubordinately, these are questions that are still the subject of heated debates between historians and military students.
The North Carolina monument on our left is probably the most famous piece of artwork on the field. It was sculptured by Gutzon Borglum, the same man who carved the images of 4 of our presidents on Mount Rushmore in South Dakota. This memorial honors the North Carolinians who participated in Pickett's charge. It shows the figure of a fallen officer turning over his command to a younger soldier. Behind them, the fears of a youthful warrior are being assuaged by a tough, seasoned veteran, and another North Carolinian proudly carries the flag of his state. The state of North Carolina suffered huge losses at Gettysburg. About 1 of every 4 Confederate casualties here was a North Carolinian. Now, let's continue our tour by driving straight ahead.
In a little less than a mile, we'll be at the Virginia Memorial. This is one of the most famous monuments in the world. It's considered by many to be the best likeness ever conceived of Robert E. Lee. The statue of his horse, Traveler, has been called the best horse ever sculptured. Most statues of horses seem to be modeled in a state of excitement, but Traveler stands with quiet dignity in the attitude of an intelligent, finely bred horse accustomed to the screeching sounds of war. The monument was unveiled on June 8, 1917, by Miss Virginia Carter, a niece of the great general. This is the only statue in the entire park of a Southern general. But Robert E. Lee was more than a Southern general. He was, in truth, a man who became a legend in his own time. When we reach Lee's statue, please pull into the parking area there. Meanwhile, let me give you some personal history of this great war leader. Robert Edward Lee was born on January 19, 1807, the youngest son of Colonel Henry Lee and his second wife, Anne Hill Carter. The general's father had also been born in Virginia and was a graduate of what is now Princeton University in New Jersey. His military career began when the American Revolution broke out. Colonel Lee served with distinction under George Washington and at that time was nicknamed Light Horse Harry. After the Revolution, he served as governor of Virginia. At the time Robert Edward was born, his dad was 51 years old. When Robert Edward Lee was 11, his father died. This brought the boy closer to his mother, who helped shape him to be the great man he later became. Lee was an excellent student. It was probably his love for mathematics that provoked him to apply to West Point. He entered the academy in 1825. During his 4 years there, he ranked high in his class. When he was graduated in 1829, he was the head of his class in mathematics and tactics, and second in his class in overall academic studies. Lee was immediately commissioned in the Corps of Engineers, which traditionally got the cream of the crop of all graduating classes. During his early career in the Army, Lee was singled out for special mention in nearly everything he did. For over 30 years, he served the United States Army, discharging every responsibility with the same dignity, skill, and gentlemanliness that earned him his exceptional reputation. Then in 1861, when Virginia seceded from the Union, General Robert E. Lee was faced with one of the most difficult decisions of his personal life. The regular United States Army tried to persuade him to remain in their service. It's said they even offered him command of the entire Union Army. But they might as well have tried to keep the world from turning. Although he found the idea of secession and slavery personally obnoxious, Robert E. Lee chose to stand by the land of his birth. In 1861, he resigned his commission in the old Army. Later, he was appointed commander of the Army of Northern Virginia. In that role, his reputation soared to unthinkable heights. General Lee was imaginative, bold, decisive, truly a born leader. His soldiers adored him, and the entire South worshipped him. After Lee's victory at Chancellorsville in May 1863, the Southern government and the Southern people believed they were but a step away from total victory. Then came Gettysburg. What happened? How could a man of such magnificent success have failed so abysmally? Historians and military students have studied and analyzed this battle since practically the day it was over, and nobody has come up with the one answer that's acceptable to everyone. But it's to the credit of this great general that he personally took the blame for the disaster at Gettysburg. After Pickett's charge, when the tattered remnants of his troops staggered back to Seminary Ridge, General Lee rode out to them and said, "This is all my fault." To General Longstreet, the man who had resisted Lee's tactics, and who many historians tag as surly and uncooperative, Lee is reported to have said, "If I had taken your advice, it might have been different." But when Pickett filed his first report, Lee read it and saw it placed the blame elsewhere. He had Pickett destroy the report and write another one. Such a man was Robert E. Lee. His military genius was exceeded only by the nobility of his soul.
Now that I've told you something about this great man, I'd like to encourage you to get out of the car and walk to the Park Service Interpretive Wayside nearby. In this area, Lee watched the attack and retreat of Pickett's division and the other Southern divisions in that famous charge of July 3rd. From here also, you can get a good view of the terrain the Southern soldiers had to cross and see the Union position on Cemetery Ridge about a mile in front of you. We'll talk in more detail about Pickett's charge later in the tour. So for now, please turn me off. Turn me on again when we leave the parking area. Our next objective, see, I'm beginning to talk like an Army officer, is at the Eisenhower Observation Tower, about 1 mile from here.
One of the greatest statesmen of our time, Sir Winston Churchill, defined the Civil War as the last war between gentlemen. Here's one explanation why that was so. Many of the decision-making, high-ranking officers of both sides had known each other personally before the Civil War broke out. Either they'd fought side by side as officers in the United States Army, or they'd gone to West Point together. In joining opposite sides, many an Army officer became an enemy to a close friend. When they met in battle, which happens so often, it's easy to understand how the absence of hate allowed for a gentleman's war. Here's a story that may interest you. Before Gettysburg, Julia Ward Howe heard boys in Union troops singing a song which intrigued her. Actually, it was a melody based on a Southern gospel hymn. The song was John Brown's Body. Miss Howe rewrote the words, giving us the song that became synonymous with the Northern cause. Know what it was? That's right, the Battle Hymn of the Republic. We've talked about the military tactics used during the battle, but we haven't forgotten that tactics are largely influenced by weapons. At Gettysburg, both sides used revolvers, swords, and bayonets. But the basic weapon carried by foot soldiers, infantrymen, was a muzzle-loading rifle musket. It was a little less than 5 feet long and weighed around 9 pounds. This weapon fired long, hollow-based lead bullets called mini balls. At a distance of 200 yards, they were lethal. And up to 1,000 yards, they were still very effective. Where artillery is concerned, the Union Army had about 350 cannons, and the Confederates had about 270. It seems to be the nature of man to talk about wars years after they happened and cover them with glory. We tend to remember the courage, the valor, and even the humor of the men who fought. But often, we dim out the grim statistics of war. Did you know that in the Civil War, more American lives were lost than in both world wars combined? That's a fact. In World War I, 116,511 Americans were killed. And in World War II, American deaths came to 405,399. Together, that comes to over 520,000. But the Civil War cost 622,511 American lives.
Now, please turn me off as this marks the end of the first half of our tour. Then flip me over and turn me on again so we can continue our tour.